Well, good afternoon. We're here today with my special guest, Lars Jensen, CEO of Vespucci Maritime in Copenhagen. Lars, it's so nice to have you again here at
pleasure
TPM.
being here.
I think you and I are making this a nice routine. I think this is our third year.
It's becoming a tradition, and your car here is never difficult to find.
A little color never hurt. And speaking of color, wow, you're putting the color in maritime with all the great protocols and news releases that you're making. I really appreciate, and our community in ocean freight shipping really appreciates your expertise and stewardship. Certainly in a time of need where leadership is lacking, you bring a lot to us to help us understand the nuances of global trade, and I want to break that down a little bit today if we could spend some time with you.
Certainly.
It's funny, last year I remember we talked about, let me give you a little promo. So we have, here at TPM, we have, Lars will be speaking tomorrow, Tuesday, on how the Gemini rotation is shaking up the schedule reliability. And that's Tuesday at 8:45 a.m., I believe. And then we have the traditional lunch with Lars on Wednesday at 12:45, which is always appropriate, the final word.
And it always seems to grow in audience. The second year it was done, they ran out of food. So let's see if we can get enough people here on Wednesday to run out of food again.
Well, I think we have so many TPM parties, we'll have a lot of food trucks left over. So maybe we should actually figure, hey, that's a good idea. We should go into business together to get all the excess food for the lunch with Lars.
Exactly.
Lars, it's funny. You have almost come up with, there's Coca-Cola, there's Pepsi, and then there's, day 469 of the Red Sea crisis. So anytime we see these great LinkedIn posts, we see this, these Lars Jensen updates, which we always appreciate. I guess my question is, while we have day 469 and there's no new news today, are we on day one or day two of a new geopolitical crisis that you'll be promoting, or that you think that we should be talking about? Have we hit a new type of crisis with what's happening geopolitically?
I'm not sure I would say we hit a new type of crisis. We hit a new type of uncertainty, I would say. And I'm not going to put numbers on that one. We could start counting from, I think, January 20th. But I'm going to stick to the count for the Red Sea. But the count aside, the uncertainty the new U.S. administration has been bringing about, I think, is unprecedented. If I look at this purely from the container shipping perspective, so let's leave the politics aside, unpredictability is basically poisonous for any supply chain. Unpredictability means cost. It means longer lead times. It means an inability to plan your supply chain for the long haul.
Sure.
And what we've been witnessing here for the last 6 weeks is nothing but unpredictability. There's been announcement of tariffs, then they have been postponed, they've been retracted, they've been coming back in. We see one proposal after the other, basically on a daily basis. And for me, it doesn't really matter whether people agree with the new administration's policies or not, but the fact is that this level of uncertainty is unprecedented and makes it impossible to plan reasonable supply chains.
We also said a funny little thing about the Red Sea when you and I met a year ago. I mean, we were on day 100 of it, and I asked you a question. And I don't know if you remember this, but I asked you, and I was taken aback by your answer. I said, Lars, could you give me, like, on a scale of 1 to 100, how uncertain or how critical this Red Sea crisis is going to be for the community? And this is back a year ago, and I remember. I think you said, I'd have to play the tape back, I think you said 80. And I was really surprised that you'd given it a stronger quantity, that the Red Sea crisis would have on impact. And then you kind of walked back a little bit, and you talked about how for the Europeans it would be a little higher than for the Americans. And that all played out really well. So with that in mind, right, how do you rate the political uncertainty that we have now, this instability? Could you give that a number as well for me? Do you follow my question?
Yeah, if I was to give that one a number, it would definitely be higher. We would be all the way up in 90 or 95. And the reason for that is, again, if we look at the last 6 weeks, again, whether you then agree or not with the Trump administration's policies, it seems, whenever they have said something, they implement it no matter what the consequences are. And some of the bills they have been proposing in even the past week is going to wreak complete havoc on the supply chain, especially the American supply chain.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that off camera with some of the Chinese, some of the tariffs potentially on vessels, and we'll get into that in a little bit if we may. I wanted to try to focus back on and move into the two sequentially. For example, on the Red Sea, right? Your updates have been pretty moderate and mild because no new developments. Are we complete with the Red Sea developments, or do you see a potential for reopening that crisis, that time of trouble? What about the Red Sea issue first? Let's cover that.
Yeah, the Red Sea one, I'm still concerned about. We've been fortunate that there was a ceasefire agreed 6 weeks ago, and clearly the Houthis were true to their word in terms of also not attacking anyone. So it's been calm for the past 6 weeks.
Okay.
The concern I have here is that the Houthis, and again, let's remember it's Iran behind the Houthis, it's not just the Houthis,
Sure.
have been pretty clear that if the ceasefire no longer holds up, they will start targeting ships again. Now the ceasefire agreement expired 2 days ago, and there's yet no new agreement between Israel and Hamas on what to do now. So we're kind of in limbo. Mm-hmm. And from an ocean carrier perspective, again, this comes down to the unpredictability. I would not put my services back through here until I am very sure that there's a long-term peace agreement. And that's not where we are right now.
Amazing that, we're on the same wavelength. One of my next questions was talking about, we talked a year ago, and I brought it up, and I felt stupid. I felt a little stupid when I asked you this, because logic would have it that my question is not a good question. But the question I asked you was that when the carriers started routing around Africa, I think I frivolously said to you, hey, now that they're getting better discipline, will they, even if the Red Sea solves itself, will they keep routing through Africa? And they kind of have, right? I guess my question is, how do you balance the uncertainty of what we've talked about so far, the Red Sea, the political uncertainty, with also the carrier discipline to maintain rates and space as healthy as they can? How does carrier discipline come into play? Or does it not? Is it shut out the window because of this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And no, I don't think there's going to be carrier discipline. I mean, right now, still they're all going around because they really have no choice. The moment the Red Sea crisis is resolved, there's going to be some turmoil. So let's skip over that part. But once the situation then stabilizes, all the carriers will go back. You can make the argument they should continue around Africa because it soaks up capacity, it props up rates, which is absolutely true. But the moment this becomes safe, rest assured, there will be at least one or two carriers that will say, I'm going to take the shortcut. And the moment one of them do that, and it's safe to do so, all the others will be forced to follow suit for competitive pressure. So once the floodgates open, my expectation is they will all go over. This will create untold congestion problems in Europe for months. But when this is solved, we're going to be back in a market where there's overcapacity, rates will drop sharply, carriers will be loss-making for a quarter or two, carriers will pull capacity back and stabilize the markets. That's basically the play out we're going to see.
Okay, that makes 100% sense. But right now, that's not where we're at, right?
No, because right now, they still go around Africa.
Lars, jumping from that to another, obviously the theme that we wanted to talk about, the political instability and some of the things that we talked about. I don't want to put you on the spot, but when you and I had an informal chat on LinkedIn and said we had a lot to talk about, after the Zelensky-Trump thing. When you watched that, President Zelensky and President Trump at the White House and the spat that they had, how did you perceive it, and how did you translate it into anything that would affect container shipping?
Yeah, so my own perception of that, you can say that's more personal than anything else, is I kind of got the same feeling. I mean, this is where I'm old too. I can remember seeing live pictures of the Berlin Wall coming down. I can remember 9/11. It kind of felt the same thing to me. From the perspective that this is one of those moments that will be remembered as this is a harbinger of a new geopolitical reality, just as it was in 1989, just as it was in 2001. So that's my takeaway from that. And when I say it's a new geopolitical reality, it's a geopolitical reality that is a lot more unstable than we have been used to.
So the fact that we had that event happen, it doesn't necessarily translate to a negativity with container shipping. It just contributes maybe to the political instability?
It contributes to the instability and the unpredictability. And you say in the short term, this is not really going to have an impact on container shipping as such. But I see the ripples from this have massive repercussions for decades to come. My take on this is I'm seeing a US that is rapidly pulling back just to the US, basically telling the rest of the world, it's not for us, we're pulling back. And I see the rest of the world looking at the Zelensky event. That's just, you can say, the tip of the iceberg. But they are seeing a U.S., and there's no polite way of saying this, they're seeing a U.S. as an untrustworthy partner. For most countries, there's nothing that can be done about that. Most countries are dependent on, for example, trade with the U.S., and that's fine. But as decisions are then getting made in the years to come, for many countries, that will be from the perspective they want to lower their engagement with the U.S. This is going to have long and permanent changes in the geopolitical world. For container shipping, that just means that fine, places that were growth areas might change. There's going to be different trade routes we're going to ship on, and it's not going to be dramatic from one day to the next. As I said, it's going to unfold over the next decade or two, but it will change.
But it will
the
impact
nature of trade.
It will impact it. Lars, you live in Copenhagen.
Yes.
You're Danish, and this is a question I threw in a few minutes ago, but I think it's relevant. I've noticed, or I've heard, that the Europeans, the EUs, want to take a more pronounced view of helping to solve the Russia-Ukraine crisis. If there's a way that they're blocking out the American solution and the Europeans are handling this, what does this forebode for Europe in the same way of the instability that we're talking about? I think you're on the same theme, so I think it's a good question.
Exactly, and it is a good question because it's, you can say, one of the consequences coming out. The way I see it is there's in Europe basically a realization now that NATO might be about to break down, the US pulling out. That means for Europe, we have a choice. Should we leave Ukraine to its own devices and be swallowed up by Russia, or should we step in and try to fill the gap as best as we could? And the choice from a European perspective is simple, because from a European perspective, this is often seen through the prism of also what was happening during the 1930s, where we also saw an aggressive power that tried to grow. There was a long time where appeasement was sought, and that absolutely led to nowhere. Most European countries at the political level still have that lesson in mind. So that's why Europe absolutely are not going down the path of appeasement, where the disappointment in many European capitals is that the US appears to be going down that path.
Excellent answer, and into my next question as I start to delve into, for example, tariffs. Do you see what may be happening in Europe and in the schism break between the U.S. and tariffs, for example? Do you see the tariff issue with Europe or China as also being dovetailing into the crisis? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's dovetailing into it. I mean, with tariffs, I was about to say in the old days is 6 weeks and more ago. The tariff discussion would be an economic discussion. It's very clear now that the tariff discussion is not just a tariff discussion. From a U.S. perspective, it's a geopolitical discussion at the same time.
Right.
So when we're talking tariffs, it's a matter of saying, well, what is the actual consequences of the tariff policy, and what is it that's been politically stated as the aim? And what I'm seeing here is a complete discrepancy between the two. Again, people can agree or disagree with the political aims of the current administration, but it's very clear that at least their political aim with the tariff is to make America stronger. When I look at the practical consequences of the tariff policy that's now being pursued, I see the exact opposite actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, I've met with a few high-level BCOs, for my own practice, and, I always talk about the fact of, when I do ocean audits, I'm returning some money to them so they can use it for general funds. Obviously, what I do can never offset the cost of these extraordinary tariffs, but how do you look at a COO or CEO, and, you've got President Trump in there, and then, it's 10% on China, then there's a new 10%. I just can't fathom how an executive, a thought leader like you, how do you explain it to a BCO in terms of what they should do to mitigate the uncertainty? And
you say that the challenge right now is there's basically only two things you can do, and quite a few are doing both at the same time. One is, to the degree possible, front load some cargo. That has been happening for a couple of months. Find some cargo, at least that helps in the short term. But for the longer term, the only thing that can be done right now is nothing. Because once you know the tariff landscape, what always happens is, okay, this was my cheapest option, now it's not cheaper, what's the second cheapest option? That is what always happens. So fine, can source from China, maybe I should do Vietnam and Cambodia. But that decision requires a certainty that this is indeed the new tariff landscape. When the landscape changes almost on a daily or weekly basis,
Right.
I cannot make that decision. So the only reasonable decision I can then make is, let's keep the train running the way it is right now until we get some sort of stability. That will increase costs. Fine, I'll have to pass that one through to my end consumers.
Right. And a very interesting take on it in the sense that it's not just tariffs. There are some very interesting sidebar type things going on here with Chinese vessels and tariffs and port call on Chinese and Chinese-built vessels that you brought to my attention. I'd like you to explain to our audience the three tenets of those potential tariffs, because I think they're misunderstood.
Yeah. I mean, there is this new proposal coming from the U.S. Trade Representative, and in highlight form, there's a lot of headlines. It's going to cost $1 million for vessels to come into U.S. ports, but it's actually much more serious than that. Just to break it down very simply, if you are a Chinese shipping line, you pay $1 million per ship you call into a U.S. port. That sounds simple enough. If your ship is Chinese built, you pay $1 million per ship to go into a U.S. port. Well, that's going to impact all of the container lines. But here's one of the real difficult ones. If you have a ship on order on a Chinese shipyard, you pay between $500,000 and $1.5 million per port call per ship, even if those ships have nothing to do with China.
Wow.
So from a shipping line perspective, the consequences of this are very, very easy to see, since this is just per ship, per port call. A normal ship that comes into, say, the US East Coast will call 3 or 4 ports. That's $3 or $4 million.
Right.
So all lines are going to change their setup. So they're just going to call one port. We're going to get massive congestion problems and schedules that are going to be impossible to deal with. But beside the monetary part, there's another element, and this impacts only US exporters, which is illogical. You would assume it would be importers as well, but it's exporters that are mentioned that basically right off the bat, 1% of their cargo must be shipped on US flag ships. Now, mind you, the global tonnage in the world with US flag is 0.5%. By year 7, 15% of their cargo must be shipped on US flag ships. But more interestingly, 5% of the cargo must be shipped on US built ships. I cannot for the life of me see where these ships are going to be built here in the US. There's even a discussion around where you're going to build the icebreakers for the US Navy. You don't have the yard capacity to do it.
I wonder if there's an opportunity downstream if any of these ships would ever be reflagged. Is that a legal possibility that they could move on?
No, I mean, you certainly could reflag ships. That would solve the part about moving on U.S. flag, but it's not going to solve the part about having the ships U.S. built.
Where they're built, right.
And in terms of flagging into U.S. flag, it depends on vessel type and where you go, but a reasonable rule of thumb is that's going to cost you 3 to 4 times more. Right. There is a reason why the U.S. have a very small merchant navy, because it's entirely uncompetitive to operate on the U.S. flag.
You know, Lars mentioned something to me off camera when we first started. We talked about this topic, and I found intriguing that, you know, some of my customers, just a very few amount, are onto this. And I think this is the big topic, and I think this is really groundbreaking that you're telling me this. We were talking about the potential quantum of spend that this could entail. And I thought maybe a couple $100 a TEU, but you were telling me something different.
Yeah, I mean, again, because it's per vessel. If it's a big vessel, the impact is smaller, but it could be a small 3,000 TEU vessel. So in some trades, you could be talking $500 to $1,000 per 40-footer, which for some trades would mean that this fee is almost the same magnitude as the freight rate itself.
Could any of this also contribute, if this goes into effect? And by the way, what in your humble opinion, what % chance do you think this has of passing?
You would say 6 weeks ago or before that, I would say 0%, because this suggestion is so obviously detrimental to the U.S. economy. So that would be in 0%.
Okay.
In the current environment, I would hesitate to even put a percentage term on. But if you look over the past 6 weeks, when the administration has said they're going to do something, especially if Trump has said it, it usually gets signed in. The saving grace on this one is it has been promoted by the U.S. Trade Representative so far. That might change a minute or a day or 2 days from now. Right. I haven't seen Trump say anything specific about it. If he comes out and says something specific, that suddenly increases the chance dramatically that this might actually happen.
You see it on my notes here. I actually talked about front loading. And the question I said was, front loading, is it over? Because I know you came out recently and talked about Professor Jason Miller's graph at Michigan State, yes. And we were talking a little bit about that. Putting that aside for a second, Do you ever see a scenario where we talked about the congestion that could possibly happen in Europe if the Red Sea opens? With this Chinese tariff issue and some of the other tariff issues, could this cause carrier discipline to make another congestion issue in the U.S.?
No, I don't see the tariffs as such making congestion issues in the U.S. I just see that as being a driver to increase costs. But there is another scenario that I think is completely underreported here in the US that could cause massive congestion. Completely different topic. You have had Elon Musk and Doge go through mass firing exercise. And again, it doesn't really matter whether people agree or not, whether that's the correct approach. But the fact is, that is what has been happening. That also means if anyone is working for the federal government, my bet is a lot of them would be looking at their jobs, say, well, maybe this is the time to find a different job somewhere else, and that's fine.
Okay.
But I could then easily see a situation where a lot of US federal agencies will become understaffed later in the year. Most critical here, US Customs. So if you see suddenly a lot of people leave federal employment for employment elsewhere, you leave US Customs understaffed, then you're going to get a massive congestion issue in the supply chain.
Wow. I hadn't thought of that. That gives me goosebumps and it gives me chills. And the reason why, audience, I think this is an important issue, I didn't know about that. I'm still really reeling what you said. But if you talk about, and you know how carriers are so creative on a different surcharge, right? Let's just say you had a Doge surcharge. Hey, that's pretty good. That's pretty good, right? No, I don't mean it for the BCOs because they hate surcharges. But you could have a Doge surcharge of $1,000. You could have a Chinese vessel surcharge of $1,000. I mean, I think I'm seeing this the start of maybe something pretty dramatic.
Yeah, but because you were the one that started to bring up, could tariffs bring disruptions? I don't see tariffs bring disruptions. They just bring cost. But if it impacts the functioning of U.S. Customs, that will be a major disruptive event.
Yeah, but Lars, if we have tariffs, right, and then we have these other events, where are people going to buy from?
Again, this is why this is going to drive inflation. And I think I mentioned it initially as well. It doesn't really matter whether people agree or disagree with Trump's policies. What I'm interested in is what are the actual consequences of these policies. And to me, the interesting part, especially for the ones that are in favor of the policies, is take a look at how are they then manifested in reality. They're accomplishing exactly the opposite of what the intention is.
Wow. This is obviously an interesting trend to follow. I want to shift gears for a second because you wrote something that was, I thought, maybe the average person missed it, glossed over it. I glommed onto it because I really respect the hell out of you. And when you wrote about a couple of weeks ago, and maybe I'm wrong, let me know if I'm in the wrong genre, but I remember you said that MSC had the new string, the Tiger string. I can't remember.
I think it was the Mustang one.
The Mustang string, and they canceled that, right? And that was the West Coast string, right? And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, that's interesting. They really invoked a lot of discipline there. But if the front loading is such a genre that people want to take advantage of, what would have made them cancel that?
I think this is more down to, and I wouldn't point just to MSC, I would point to not all four alliances. Keep in mind, Ocean Alliance is unchanged. But the other three alliances, they are all putting in their new networks, and I'm sure they have done very, very good work in designing the networks, but it's still a theoretical piece of work. It's like when you go into war, your battle plan doesn't survive the first day.
Right.
And I think that's also what we should expect, not just from MSC, but also from Premier Alliance and from Gemini. As they're launching the networks, it meets reality, and that means they're going to tweak the networks and change them to fit, okay, it didn't quite pan out the way we had planned, so we're going to see a lot of these adjustments here in the coming months.
And just to paraphrase that, I think like what I was thinking in my mind, I know you're speaking about the Gemini experiment, or the Gemini string and its hub and spoke features. Would you say that, well, I guess the answer is yes, it's a little stilted to measure it right now because of all the political events and tariff events. But I mean, is it does that need more time to percolate? In other words,
yeah. I mean, even in normal market circumstances, without the political turmoil, without the Red Sea turmoil, it would be months before you could hope for the network to create the stability and for in this case Gemini to reach their 90%.
Right. But you feel it's on track, though.
Yeah, it's hard to say at this point in time. I'd rather say it this way, that I would think that they can actually pull off the 90% that they have been advertised. I know basically all shippers are extremely skeptical out there, and no, I'm not paid by neither carrier to say this at all, but I genuinely believe they can actually pull it off.
Right, right. Oh, it's going to be great to see. Lars, we have a few minutes left. I wanted to talk about the fact that spot rates in many of the trades, almost all the trades, have been falling rapidly. Do you see any stability of those continuing to fall, or do you see anything that was safety net that will stop that?
Yeah, the key trigger to watch here is the Red Sea. If the Red Sea crisis continues, then the fall we've seen now, it's partly seasonal and partly is a bit of a price war as the carriers find their legs in the new alliances and want to hold on to their market shares. If the Red Sea continues, it's going to bottom out during March, April, and we're going to see an increase again coming into peak season.
So it's really the Red Sea that's driving it?
I mean, the Red Sea is keeping a floor under the rates. Otherwise, they would have dropped a lot more.
Understood. I'm totally with you. And then the last question I have is probably the one you've been asked the most, and probably the one you have the hardest ability to answer. Just in final closing moments of word with Lars today, what are the two pieces of advice that you'd give to BCOs that are signing contracts in the next couple of weeks?
Try to build in as much flexibility in those contracts as possible. And for a shipper, remember that all the uncertainties they have in terms of what's going to happen, the carrier have the same uncertainty. So it should be possible to find common ground in having various levels of flexibility in the contract to take into account these very unpredictable events.
And one last one that I just thought of off the fly. You know, you're so close to many of the executives, the leading executives of the best steamship lines and carriers in the world. Privately or off the record, or just in general, without naming names, would you say how are they feeling about the world events? Do they take the same ilk that they've never seen like this in anything like this in their career, or do they think it's just part of the interesting course of history and containerization?
I would say the latter, and we actually saw that very clearly in the opening session at TPM here with Søren Toft from MSC up there. I think he very eloquently put it out there and said, well, this is par for the course in the shipping industry. I mean, things always change, and this is the beauty of being in shipping. Ships can then be moved to other places. Imagine if this was built with railroads, you couldn't move.
Right. Wow, that's a very interesting take and a good final word, but I think it's an exciting time to be alive, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Well, Lars, I can't thank you enough for all the time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
It was a great dialogue, and I thank you for accepting my impromptu questions, but we learned a lot today from you, and especially I think the overall audience on LinkedIn will find these topics something that all the people in their supply chain and management team should be looking at. So you can reach Lars on LinkedIn, Vespucci Maritime, and just about anywhere containerization is mentioned, he's in the forefront. And I'm always appreciative of our time together. Thank you again.
Thanks so much for inviting me.